This video is about what became the most important part of rebuilding my heating system, at least for me, because it was the part that I knew the least about when I started working on it. And I'm going to break it into two pieces, the two simple concepts in plumbing and wiring, but that I knew nothing about ahead of time. Single pole double throw switches and tight T's in plumbing. It should go without saying that these videos are not to tell you how to build a heating system like I did. They're really two purposes. One is to explain things that I wish I'd understood before I started figuring out how to do mine, and also largely as a record for myself, so a few years from now when something breaks and I'm into some other project and I have to go back and figure out how I did this, I have some kind of record of how I put it together and why. Here's the challenge. You've got a source of heat, like my wood boiler, or in my case, two wood boilers and a thermal tank. So I've got a propane boiler as a backup, a wood boiler that can provide heat, and then a thermal tank full of 1,000 gallons of water that's getting heated up, and then when it's hot becomes its own source of heat for heating the house. And the challenge is to direct that heat from those sources of heating to the radiators in the house, and how to switch all that, how to control all that. All that heat is directed by means of circulator pumps that pump water, hot water around. How do you direct that water in the right places, and how do you switch things on and off to make it go where you want it when you need it there? This is pretty simple stuff for most plumbing systems. It's really even pretty simple in my system, but the additional complication in mine is that I wanted the wood boiler to heat water and send it to the house. And then I wanted it to, when the house was hot, I wanted it to send heat to the thermal tank and store that heat in the hot water. And then when the house called for heat later and the fire had gone out in the boiler, I wanted the house to know to get the heat from the thermal tank, and if the thermal tank was too cold, to default to the propane boiler. Last year, what I did, it was a simpler setup. I just ran the wood boiler, and the wood boiler heated up the thermal tank, and the house pulled heat off the thermal tank, and if the thermal tank was cold, then it defaulted to the propane. So there's some problems with that, and I'll get into them later. But that was a simple system, no commingling of the water. So the water that was heating the house was different than the water that was running through the boiler. The boiler water would run into the heat exchanger in the bottom of the thermal tank, heat up the thermal tank, and when the house needed water, or needed heat, it would pull water, it would pump the water that was in the radiators through the heat exchanger in the top of the thermal tank, collect heat that way, and distribute it to the house. That was a very simple system, and it worked last winter. It heated the house all winter, but there were some problems with it. But these two videos are going to be one on the plumbing and one on the switching. Here's the manifold or header that distributes the water to the radiators. So you can see that the hot water comes in here and then flows out through the distribution, pushed by these green circulator pumps out to the radiators. And after it goes through the radiator, it cools off and it comes back in the other end of the header. That's the cycle that it does to distribute the heat to the house. Now let's see where the heat comes from. Here are my three potential sources of heat. We've got the propane boiler, the thermal tank, which is the big tank of water that gets heated by the wood boiler, and the wood boiler. But first, an explanation of the tight T's. Tight T's are just a T in the supply line of water that's close together, and as close together as you can get them, I guess, is they work better. So let's look at a simple case here with the water coming from the propane boiler. So you've got hot water coming from the propane boiler, that little green circulator, that's my symbol of a circulator, pushing the water on that red line, and it comes into the header. And at the same time that it's being pushed in there by the propane boiler, one of the circulator pumps is also on, distributing it to the radiator. So instead of just looping around and going right back to the boiler, it gets pulled through one of the radiators, around, cooled down, and comes in the other end of the header, and then it gets returned to the propane boiler. Okay, so now let's look at how the rest of the system works. There's the wood boiler, which is kind of on its own. It doesn't really talk to the rest of the system. It just produces heat, produces hot water, sends it into the thermal tank. It goes into the bottom of the thermal tank where there's a heat exchanger and heats up the water. There's and then there's, you see those are the inputs for the bottom heat exchanger, and then on the top are the inputs for the top heat exchanger where you can take water out of the thermal tank if you want to. So the wood boiler is just doing its thing, heating up the water, sending it to the thermal tank. The thermal tank can also send water to the header. There's a circulator there that can cycle the hot water that through the top heat exchanger in the thermal tank and send that to the header. And then I put a set of tight tees on the loop that feeds from the wood boiler to the thermal tank, and that loop, that set of tight tees goes also to the header, so that the water the hot water coming directly out of the wood boiler can be directed straight into the radiator system, straight into the distribution system for the house. This was what I didn't do in the first year. The first year I had this system. The wood boiler heated up the thermal tank. The thermal tank sent water to the header and distributed it to the house. And the problem with that was that when I was outputting water at 180 degrees from the wood boiler and heating up the thermal tank, I'd get the thermal tank running at, I don't know, 165, 170, sometimes 150, but it was never 180, especially when the house was calling for water. And so I was always feeding water to the radiators that was less than 180. And the radiators dramatically lose efficiency in radiating BTUs as the temperature goes down. I think it's 40% less radiated heat at 150 degrees than there is at 180 degrees. So I really wanted a way to send that hot water from the wood boiler that was coming out of the boiler at 180 right into the distribution system. And that's what this set of closed tees on the supply line from the wood boiler does. Allows me to send it right into the radiators and heat up the house that way. And then when the house is warm, the circulator that would be pulling the water through that tight tee, that circulator turns off and the water just goes through the thermal tank and heats up the thermal tank. How this all gets controlled is the subject of my next video. Okay, here's a video of the tight tees in real life. They're the ones that run the propane boiler, and then to the right of them are the ones that take the loop from either directly from the wood boiler or from the thermal tank. Here are the circulators. And here, looking at it from the other side, is where the pipes come across from the, that's the loop right there that takes it out of the top of the heat exchanger, the top of the thermal tank, top heat exchanger. And then here are the pipes there's the tight tees that go to the wood boiler. So that wood boiler line would either go directly into the thermal tank or get pulled off into the header. All right, well, I just watched my own video. Sorry for that. It was so boring it was painful for me to watch. The thing is, when I was building this heating system last winter and then this fall, I really wish I'd had a video like that to explain some of this stuff to me. Instead, I had my neighbor, who was fantastic and gave me a lot of great advice. And but I mean, it wasn't like I had him here all the time. It, really would have been helpful to have a video. So I hope it helps somebody. The next one's going to be just as bad about the switching, actually worse because it's more complicated. And then after that, I'm going to make interesting videos about boring, simple things where I don't have to talk and figure it out.